They say time changes everything, and maybe that's true, but not this land. This land remembers. Every rock, every tree, every broken fence post. It all tells a story. My name is Jack Monroe, and for nearly 80 years, this land belonged to my family. My grandfather bought it after the war, said he needed peace, space, and a place where no one could tell him what to do. He built a dam at the edge of a small lake that fed the surrounding pastures and orchards. That dam wasn't just a wall of stones and concrete, it was a symbol of independence. It gave life to the fields, watered the cattle, and over time, created something beautiful. A quiet little lake with birds, fish, and trees that leaned over it like old friends. My father took over after Grandpa passed. He expanded the orchard, added a few barns, and always told me, "Jack, no matter what happens, protect this land." And I did. For decades, through droughts, storms, and even the loss of my wife, I held on to this land. It was more than soil and timber, it was family. But then came the HOA, not all at once. No, they crept in slow like a shadow at dusk. It started with the Hendersons building a vacation home just past the eastern ridge. Then a few more homes popped up, modern, cold, out of place, city folks with clean boots and loud opinions. One day, a fancy sign went up at the entrance of the old road, Whispering Pines Lakeside Community managed by Horizon Living. I laughed at first, thought it was a joke, but then came the letters, notice of easement violation, request for land assessment, urgent, meeting attendance required. I ignored them. This was my land, always had been. But ignorance, I learned, doesn't stop bureaucracy. One morning I found a group of men in hard hats walking my fields, pointing, measuring, nodding like they owned the place. I confronted them, of course. Told them to get the hell off my property. One of them, a young guy with slicked back hair and a tablet, said, "Sir, according to county records and the updated zoning map filed last year, this parcel falls within the jurisdiction of Whispering Pines HOA." I laughed in his face. "Son, my family's had this land since your granddaddy was in diapers. Get off it before I call the sheriff." But they didn't leave, not really. They just kept coming back, with forms, with inspectors, with smug attitudes and veiled threats. Then came Karen Weaver, HOA president. She drove a silver Range Rover and had the personality of a hornet's nest. Showed up on my porch one Sunday morning, uninvited, holding a clipboard and a paper cup of herbal tea. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "we need to discuss the non-compliant structures on your property." "What structures?" I asked. "The red barn, for starters. It's an eyesore. It violates architectural uniformity codes, page 16 of the Whispering Pines Covenant." I almost choked on my coffee. "That barn's older than you. It housed my grandfather's tools and my father's livestock. Be that as it may," she said, "it's subject to removal." I told her where she could shove her clipboard. She smiled not kindly and said, "You'll be hearing from us." And I did. Fines, warnings, more visits. They tried everything. Said my fencing was too rustic. My dog barked too loud. My tractor made dust, but I held firm until the day I came home from town and saw the smoke. Not the kind from a chimney or a brush fire, the thick, dark smoke of destruction. My barn, leveled, reduced to smoldering wood and ash. A yellow tape circled the area, and in the middle stood Karen, arms folded, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies. "Mr. Monroe," she said, "your structure was in direct violation. The board approved emergency removal. You were notified." I stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, not because of the barn, but because of the look on her face. The smug satisfaction, like she'd won something. That night, I sat by the lake, watched the moon ripple in the water, and remembered the valve. See, when my grandfather built the dam, he installed a runoff valve. Big iron wheel under a rusted hatch. It controlled the lake's overflow, used it maybe twice in 50 years, but I maintained it. Greased the gears, oiled the bolts, just in case. Whispering Pines had built their little clubhouse, tennis courts, and fancy dock on the lake's edge all downstream from that valve, and while they were busy filing papers and burning barns, they forgot who held the key. I waited until spring, after the snowmelt swelled the lake, after the ducks returned and the tourists started renting kayaks. Then one quiet morning I walked to the hatch, took out the old brass key, and opened it. The valve groaned, resisted, then turned. Water rushed, First a trickle, then a roar, down the slope, across the manicured lawns, through the box court, into the infinity pool behind Karen's ecolodge. Phones rang. People screamed, sirens wailed, and I made coffee, sat on my porch, watched the chaos unfold. By noon, half the HOA prized real estate was underwater. Karen showed up, soaked, furious. "You'll pay for this," she shouted. I sipped my drink. "No, Karen, I already did." Lawsuits came, media too. Local man floods gated community. But I had the deeds, the maps, the key, and the truth. The land remembered, and so did I. That lake is calm again now, the dock's gone, the Range Rover's rusting in the reeds. But the trees still lean over the water, like old friends, and the dam still standing, just like me. By the end of the week, word about the dam valve had spread. Locals from the nearby town started driving out to see what was left of the HOA precious lake. The resort they'd built with those expensive cottages now looked like a sun-baked ghost town. Cracked lake beds stretched for acres. Docks that once held kayaks and paddle boats now hung crooked in the air. The fish were gone, the tourists stopped coming, and the HOA, oh, they were furious. I sat on my porch sipping iced tea, watching as HOA members pulled up in shiny SUV, staring in disbelief at the dry, Doubt lake like their world had just crumbled. They marched up my driveway one afternoon, led by some guy named Peterson. He was the new HOA president, dressed like he was heading to court, crisp suit, briefcase in hand, and rage in his eyes. "Mr. Monroe," he said, tight-lipped, "we need to talk." I didn't even get up from my rocking chair. "You can talk right there, no need to track dirt on my porch. You shut the main dam valve that fed our lake. That property is part of our ecosystem and community. You've caused irreparable harm to residents and business owners." I raised an eyebrow. "You demolished my barn without notice, said my family's property was an eyesore." Peterson opened his briefcase and pulled out some paperwork. "We have legal authority from the county." "You had no authority on my land. That dam's been in my family since 1947, built by my grandfather. I maintain it. I own it. Always have." He glanced at the dry lake, then back at me. "What do you want, Mr. Monroe? Money? A settlement?" I laughed. A deep, honest laugh that probably unnerved him. "I don't want your money. I want you gone." That hit him hard. The blood drained from his face. "Excuse me. Your HOA built part of your development on my land. You trespassed, and you leveled my barn." Peterson stammered. "We followed all the proper." I cut him off. "Didn't ask what you followed. I've got title maps, deeds, surveyor reports. You're in violation." He tried to keep calm, but I could see it. The panic settling into his chest. This can be worked out. You've got 30 days to remove everything on my land, cottages, fences, paths, whatever you built, or I start digging trenches and bulldozing it myself. That night, I pulled out the original land deed my grandfather kept in a weatherproof box under the floorboards of the barn, back when it still stood. It was signed by the county clerk, dated 1948. And it proved what I already knew. The HOA had crossed the line, literally. Over the next few days, I paid for a private land surveyor. He was retired but came highly recommended. We walked the perimeter, flagged every boundary, and double-checked the lines. Sure enough, 35 homes built by the HOA stood partially or completely on Monroe land. The legal documentation was airtight. When the HOA board got the results, their tone changed. Suddenly, they weren't angry, they were scared. I received letters, calls, even gifts dropped off at the porch. One neighbor baked me a pie, another offered to mediate, but it was too late for peace offerings. They dug their own grave when they sent in those demolition crews. Then came the media. A local news station caught wind of the story. Elderly landowner battles HOA over property rights. They sent a crew out, filmed me next to the dried lake bed, wide hat on my head, holding the original deed like it was the Constitution. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs, I said on camera, but this land remembers, and so do I. The video went viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, people from all over the country cheering me on. I became a symbol for everyone who'd been bullied by their HOA. Some folks even drove out to show support. They brought signs, coffee, even homemade jam. For once, I wasn't just an old man with a rocking chair. I was a movement. The HOA scrambled. They filed for emergency injunctions, tried to prove the dam wasn't legally theirs or mine, but nothing held up. Every record backed me. The court dates started stacking. Legal teams were called in from both sides. I hired a sharp young lawyer, new to the game but hungry. She said my case was solid and advised we push for full damages, including emotional distress and replacement of the demolished barn. The trial took 6 months. I showed up every day, suit and all. I sat quietly while the HOA lawyers blabbered about community plans, economic setbacks, environmental concerns. But when it was my turn, I pulled out the deed, the photos, the footage, the surveyor maps, and the letters they'd sent threatening me. I didn't need to yell. The truth did the work. The jury didn't take long. They ruled in my favor. Full damages awarded. HOA ordered to remove their structures from my land and rebuild the barn to original specs. They had 90 days. Word spread like wildfire. HOA boards across the state held emergency meetings, suddenly rechecking their boundaries. I had neighbors I'd never met bringing me baked goods and telling me I was a hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like an old man who got lucky enough to still have his voice and use it. The lake never filled up again. Even when they tried to restore it, the surrounding wells had shifted. The land had changed, like it remembered, and so did I. Some things, once lost, don't come back the same, and that's just fine. Jack stood there for a moment, watching the silence after the flood. The water wasn't raging. It was steady, determined like him. It moved with purpose, a quiet force reclaiming what was stolen. He turned his back on the roar behind him and walked slowly down the ridge toward what used to be his family's land. The truck rumbled along the dirt road, tires splashing through the muddy ground. Jack's hands were steady on the wheel, face unreadable, but his eyes were locked on what lay ahead. As he approached the newly built neighborhood, neatly paved streets, mailboxes still shining like teeth, he noticed a few homeowners outside, confused. Some were already taking out their phones, filming, yelling. Water rushed through the culvert, under the roads, around the foundations. It was rising. One man ran up to Jack's truck as he slowed to a stop, screaming something about insurance, lawsuits, and destruction. Jack rolled down the window slowly. "You built on my land," he said plainly. "Now my land is taking it back." The man stood speechless as Jack drove off again. He wasn't here to argue. He had said all he needed. Within the hour, news crews were on the scene. Drones buzzed overhead. Reporters stood ankle deep in water with rain jackets and solemn expressions, delivering breaking news coverage with dramatic pauses and urgent tones. This quiet development outside of town has turned into a disaster zone, one anchor said, while the camera panned over waterlogged streets, submerged basements, and floating patio furniture. Jack didn't care. He watched from the cabin, sipping coffee. His dog sat by his feet, tail flicking slowly. The dam had done its work. Now nature would handle the rest. The HOA board was in full panic mode. Emergency meetings were held at makeshift locations, church basements, hotel lobbies, anywhere dry enough to gather. Lawsuits were threatened, lawyers called, but Jack had done his homework. He had records, deeds, maps, and witness statements. Everything proving the HOA had built beyond their legal limits. The land had been swindled, and no amount of polished PR from the board could hide it anymore. Then came the investigations. County officials showed up in boots and long coats. Inspectors took photos, measured distances, scratched their heads. FEMA agents assessed damage. Environmental groups became involved, questioning the permit approvals and drainage plans. The more they looked, the more they found wrong. The HOA glossy reputation began to crumble like the damp drywall in those luxury homes. Jack received a letter from a lawyer a week later, trying to threaten him with willful damage and negligent endangerment. He framed it and hung it on the wall. Below it, he pinned the original deed his grandfather had signed decades ago with the hand-written note, "Monroe land do not sell, ever." Days turned into weeks. Some of the homeowners moved out, never to return. Others stayed, trying to salvage what they could, pumping basements and ripping out flooring. The HOA president, the same woman who had once proudly ordered Jack to remove his barn, had gone silent. Rumor had it she was hiding out in another state. Good, Jack didn't need to see her. He just needed to be left alone. One morning, he walked out to the ridge again. The sun was rising over the misty landscape. The lake had calmed now, its surface glassy, reflecting the sky above. A heron stood near the edge, still and proud. Jack took off his hat, ran a hand through his gray hair, and smiled. The land was healing. His family's name still meant something here, and the message had been sent loud, clear, and carried by water. Back in town, people started talking, quietly at first, then more openly. Some supported Jack. They saw him as a defender, a symbol of resistance against corporate greed. Others called him dangerous, a vigilante. Either way, his story spread. Jack didn't care much about the noise. He wasn't looking for praise or condemnation. He just wanted what was his to be respected. One afternoon, a teenage boy from town came up to Jack at the hardware store. "Are you the guy who flooded those houses?" he asked, wide-eyed. Jack looked at him, expression steady. "No," he said. "I'm the guy who opened a valve." The boy grinned. "That's badass." Jack just nodded and walked away. Months later, the county issued a formal report. It confirmed what Jack already knew. The development had encroached illegally onto his land. Fines were issued. The HOA was dissolved. A few former board members tried to run for local office. None succeeded. Jack's land, though wet and scarred, was his again. He rebuilt the barn. Not the same, but strong. His neighbors helped this time. Volunteers came out, some bringing wood, others just offering time and hands. He didn't ask for it, but accepted it anyway. A small gesture of balance, maybe, a token of respect. On a cool spring morning, Jack stood at the edge of the new structure, looking across the field. Wildflowers were starting to return. Bees hummed. A breeze carried the smell of fresh wood and damp soil. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. The dam, now repaired, held steady again. Water flowing gently, under control, just like it should be. The land didn't forget, and neither did Jack. Summer came fast that year. The grass grew tall, the trees fuller than ever before, and the air had a different feeling, cleaner, quieter. Jack spent most of his days out on the land again, fixing fence lines, planting small patches of vegetables, walking the dog along old trails. It wasn't about farming. It wasn't even about the work. It was about presence, about being rooted again in something that mattered. One afternoon, a couple in their mid-30s stopped their pickup at the edge of his property. They introduced themselves, Sarah and Micah from the next town over. They'd heard about what happened about the HOA scandal and came to ask if Jack would consider leasing them a small portion of his land for a homestead project. They didn't want to develop, just grow food, raise chickens, teach their kids about living simply. Jack looked them over, honest eyes, calloused hands, no clipboards, no suits. After a long pause, he said, "Let's walk." They hiked the property together, stepping through thistle and brush, listening to birds and distant creek water. Jack pointed out places where his grandfather had once built benches, places where he'd buried old tools. The couple listened, nodding, sometimes smiling, sometimes silent. By the end of the walk, Jack agreed to their request. No contracts, no deposits, just a handshake. That's how things were supposed to be done. That's how they always had been. Word spread slowly, but truthfully. Others started visiting, not developers or buyers, but veterans, naturalists, teachers. They didn't want to take, they wanted to learn. Jack became unwillingly something like a mentor, a quiet legend, a man who didn't just stand up to a corrupt system, but who reminded people that land is more than numbers on paper, its memory, its soul. The lake stabilized again, fish returned, birds nested along the shoreline, beavers rebuilt dams deeper in the woods. It was as if nature understood the battle had ended, and now it could begin the healing. Jack started keeping a notebook again, something he hadn't done since he was a teen. He jotted notes about the weather, about the wildflowers blooming, about how long it took to mend a certain fence or fix a leaky barn gutter. Some days he'd write a single sentence, "The wind was strong today." Other days, pages would fill with thoughts about legacy, about mistakes, about what his grandfather would have said if he'd seen the HOA tearing everything down. He imagined him often, not as a ghost, but a voice, sitting on the porch at dusk, laughing with a mug of coffee, saying things like, "You don't let folks build where they don't belong." Or sometimes justice comes in gallons, not guns. Jack didn't seek revenge. He sought restoration, and slowly, day by day it came. There were still reminders of the fight. Ruined houses stood like skeletons along the edges of the flood path. Some were torn down, others left to rot. Jack didn't bother with them. They were warnings now, monuments to arrogance, proof that concrete and siding mean nothing without respect. In early fall, Jack was invited to a community town hall, not by any HOA or politician, but by the townspeople themselves. Farmers, artists, students, they wanted to honor him. Jack refused the spotlight but agreed to show up. When he entered the small hall, a room no bigger than a high school gym, the crowd stood, some clapped. Some just nodded. There were no speeches, no awards, just a small plaque made by hand with the words carved into rough oak. He remembered what they forgot. Jack touched it once, nodded his thanks, and left. That night he built a fire in the old ring behind his cabin. The dog curled beside him, and the stars opened above like they always had, quiet, bright, eternal. A letter arrived weeks later from the federal agency that had reviewed the flood damage. Not a threat this time, not a summons. It was an apology, official, signed, and notarized. It admitted fault in approving the HOA permits, acknowledged Jack's ownership, and offered compensation. Money, access to grants, even tax credits. Jack read it slowly, then tossed it in the fire. The land didn't need payments. It needed protection. It needed people who gave a damn. And now it had that again. By the time winter set in, the land had taken on a new rhythm. Not faster or busier, just deeper, more real. There was a sense of stillness, not from isolation, but from resolution. Jack had found peace, but not in the way people usually mean it. It wasn't peace like silence or calm. It was peace like knowing where you stand, like being rooted so firmly in your truth that nothing can move you. Each morning, Jack stepped out onto the porch, breathed in the cold air, and watched his land breathe back. Deer tracks across the frozen creek, smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the faint hum of life continuing in spite of everything. That was peace. One afternoon, while clearing out the last of the flood-damaged brush near the dam, Jack stumbled upon something unexpected, an old mason jar half buried in the dirt. Inside was a rolled-up photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photo was yellowed, curled at the edges. It showed his grandfather, young, standing beside the original dam, smiling, proud. Behind him, two men Jack didn't recognize, both wearing overalls and sun hats. The paper was a handwritten note, faded but legible. "We built this for freedom, not to control, not to profit, just freedom." Jack sat there in the cold mud for a long time, reading it again and again. That single sentence struck him harder than any court order or lawsuit ever had. It was legacy not in buildings or borders but in intention, in heart. Weeks passed. Jack started rebuilding the barn. Not all of it, just the frame, enough to stand tall again, not as a shelter for animals but as a monument, a reminder. The younger families who had moved in nearby came to help. They brought their kids. They brought tools. They brought lunch. They brought stories. And Jack, for the first time in a long while, listened, really listened. He saw the fire in their eyes, not just anger, but determination. These weren't people trying to go back to the old ways. They were trying to build something better. One evening, as the frame of the barn stood silhouetted against a red sky, a teenage boy from the nearby family asked Jack, "Do you think it'll happen again? Another HOA, another fight?" Jack looked out over the hills, his jaw set. "Maybe," he said, "but next time they'll know we don't bend easy." The boy nodded and walked back to the others, leaving Jack standing alone with the wind and the wood. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was promise. That night, Jack pulled an old wooden box from under his bed. Inside were dozens of letters, most unopened, from years ago, from attorneys, realtors, HOA officials. Some threatened, some pleaded. He threw them into the fireplace one by one, watching each curl and turn to ash. In the bottom of the box was something he hadn't touched in decades, his father's hunting knife. The leather sheath was cracked, the blade rusted along the edge. He didn't take it out. He just held it for a while, then returned it gently to its place. Not all weapons were made for war. Some were meant to remind you who you are. The next morning, Jack installed a sign beside the rebuilt barn. Simple letters burned into oak. "This land remembers." That was all, no politics, no slogans, just truth. People started coming from farther away, not as tourists, but as pilgrims. Veterans, teachers, widows, farmers, some came to see the dam, some came to ask questions, Some came just to sit in silence near the fire pit out back. Jack didn't always talk. Sometimes he just poured coffee and sat beside them, letting the silence do the work. He wasn't trying to be a leader. He just didn't leave. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year. Snow melted quickly. Rivers swelled for a few weeks, and the grass came in thicker and greener than Jack had seen in a decade. Birds returned in flocks, louder, bolder, as if the land itself had been holding its breath all winter and was now ready to exhale. The barn frame stood solid through the frost, and Jack began adding walls. Not uniform, not modern salvaged wood, some of it charred, some twisted from years of storms. He didn't sand it down or paint it. He wanted every scar to show. Every plank was a piece of a story. That same month, a man in a navy suit drove up the old road. His car didn't make it far. The gravel was too rough, so he walked the last half-mile in polished shoes and a loosened tie. He was a lawyer, young, stiff, probably sent by someone with more money than time. Jack met him halfway, leaning on a shovel, watching as the man tried not to slip in the mud. "Mr. Monroe," the man asked, panting. Jack nodded. The lawyer pulled a folded document from his coat. "They're offering a final settlement. They're willing to rebuild the barn, full value, no conditions." Jack didn't move. "And the dam?" he asked. The lawyer paused. "They want it decommissioned, permanently drained." Jack looked at the papers but didn't take them. "Go back," he said. "Tell them we already settled things. Water flows, trees grow, life moves on." The lawyer blinked. "That's not legally binding." Jack smiled. "Neither is trust, but I still believe in it." The man left without saying another word. Word of that visit spread. Not because Jack told anyone, but because the lawyer had stopped by 2 other properties nearby, trying to coax them into supporting the deal. No one did. In fact, 2 families offered to donate lumber to finish the barn roof. Another brought in a generator. A retired carpenter even showed up with blueprints for reinforcing the dam, just in case. It wasn't just Jack's stand anymore. It was the community's. Something had shifted. The land, once nearly bought out by convenience and concrete, was now being reclaimed by grit and goodwill. Jack started journaling again late at night, by oil lamp, on thick old paper. He didn't write for anyone else. Just himself. He wrote about the birds nesting in the rafters, about the wildflowers returning to the hill, about the laughter of children skipping stones on the creek. He wrote about the silence, too. The good kind, the kind that feels like an answer. One entry simply read, "They tried to erase me. Now they visit and say thank you. Funny how the wind turns." It wasn't smug. It was steady, like a man who had seen both fire and frost and knew he could outlast either. One Saturday, just after sunrise, Jack climbed the old path above the dam. From there, you could see nearly everything: the barn, the lake, the ridge where the first HOA signs had been planted. He stood still for a long time, eyes scanning the land. The air smelled like cedar and cold water. Then, without warning, he laughed. Just one short, sharp laugh, not bitter, not loud, just honest. That laugh said everything. "I'm still here. You didn't win. I didn't break." He headed back down, slower than he used to, but with purpose. There was more to build. Not walls or fences, but bridges. Not with nails, but with hands. The kind of work that didn't make headlines but changed everything. Quiet revolutions start like that, with one man refusing to move, then another, then a family, then a town, then the land itself begins to stand. Summer came with its own rhythm: long days, thick with heat and the smell of pine sap, and quiet nights lit by fireflies and frog song. Jack's barn stood finished now, not in defiance but in memory. It wasn't about rebuilding what was lost. It was about honoring what still stood. Inside, tools were hung with care. Old family heirlooms were arranged on handmade shelves, and in one corner sat his grandfather's rocking chair, polished, not perfect, just right. People started visiting more often. Some were neighbors, bringing jam or fresh bread. Others were strangers, families from across the county, even folks from nearby cities who had heard whispers of a man who stood his ground when the suits came to pave over peace. They didn't come to take selfies or record videos. They came to listen. Jack would pour them tea, offer a spot under the shade tree, and let them talk. And they did about their own fights, their own stolen spaces, their own quiet griefs. Somehow, this place made them feel understood. Then came the letter, certified from a judge, not a threat, not an order, but a ruling. Jack read it once, then again. It declared the HOA easement void built on bad faith annexation, hidden language, and fabricated community consensus. The land was never theirs, it never legally could have been. The lake, the dam, the barn's footprint all returned to Jack's sole title. The paper shook in his hand, but not from nerves, from the weight of knowing that right had finally outrun clever. He didn't celebrate, not loudly. He folded the letter, placed it in an old tobacco tin his grandfather used to carry, and buried it under the cedar tree next to the dam, not out of spite, out of respect. Some things belong to the land, not a frame. Some victories don't need to be framed on walls. They just need to settle back into the soil. Later that year, Jack began carving wooden signs by hand, not for sale. Just names of families, of creeks, of long-forgotten footpaths. He placed them all over the property one at a time. Reminders that this land wasn't empty, wasn't erased, it remembered, and it would keep remembering. The HOA, stripped of power, tried to recover, pivoting to other developments, new targets, but something had changed. Other towns heard the story. They started asking questions, forming groups, pushing back. Jack's quiet defiance had echoed beyond his fence line. It had become a ripple, maybe even a wave. Years passed. Jack grew older, slower, but never softer. On his final birthday, a crowd gathered at the barn. Neighbors, kids now grown, a few old rivals who had since changed their minds. Someone asked him what he'd do differently if he could start over. Jack thought for a moment. "I'd plant more trees," he said, "and I'd build a second dam." They all laughed, but he didn't. Not because he was angry, but because he meant it. That winter, when Jack passed peacefully in his sleep, the entire town came to the barn. They didn't hold a funeral, they held a gathering. They told stories under the stars, sang songs, cooked meals on open fires. Someone carved a plaque and nailed it above the barn doors. It read, "This land remembers, and so do we. To this day, the water still flows, the trees still grow, the barn still stands." And so does the story, not just of Jack Monroe, but of anyone who's ever stood up and said, "This is mine, this matters, you will not take it." Because some things are worth more than money, some lines are never meant to be crossed. And sometimes, a man, a dam, and a broken-down barn are enough to stop the world.